Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Startup Operator podcast. I'm Roshan Cariappa. My guest today is Rishi Agrawal, who is the CEO of Avantis Tech. Avantis is one of the leading RegTech companies in India. Now, Rishi is passionate about photography, travel, and compliance. We dive deep into that last interest of his as I tried to navigate the complex web of compliance in India. Why do we have so many laws and policies? What should one do to comply with all of them? How does Rishi and his team operate in this space, which has as much information asymmetry? What are the nuances of building a product that has to serve a wide spectrum of users across industries? And how do they keep up with the 4,500 or so laws that change annually in India and also differ state by state? This is a truly fascinating conversation about something that is fundamental to every kind of business. So sit back and maybe take notes as Rishi explains compliance to us in a super interesting way. Hi, Rishi. Welcome to the Startup Operator podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Most welcome. It's a pleasure, Gary.
Yeah, really looking forward to this conversation. And to set the context, could you talk a little bit about your founding journey with Avantis, and how do you think about an enterprise application on the compliance side? It doesn't seem like it's a conventional choice.
Well, great question, Gary. Thank you so much for picking that up. Very interesting. I'll walk you back to the year 2013. I had spent almost 12 years working with Bank of New York Mellon, and I was running their India center out of Pune, and been doing that for a sizable period of time. And it was quite challenging, to say the least, and I was really enjoying my time. But the entrepreneurial itch had become very strong since 2010. And I really wanted to do something exciting, challenging. Startups were becoming the talk of the town. Technology was taking the world by a storm. It was penetrating into every single critical business process. And I wanted to do something in that space, but didn't understand what problem can I solve which was worth solving. So a few things were going on, right? While I was heading the center here based in Pune, I was starting to feel the heat of compliance, how critical it was, how complex it was, and so on. So as a user, I had a first-hand view of the compliance. At the same time, my co-founder Sandeep and I, both of us were first cousins, and we used to talk about what could I do differently being an entrepreneur. And like that, many conversations happened. And one fine morning, he and I sat down because he wanted to build a compliance app for his clients because he was running his own CA practice. He brought in great experience around governance, risk, and compliance. And I started going deeper to understand why was he trying to solve this problem? Why was it so important? Why does it need a solution? And we started talking deep, and I realized suddenly that Companies Act of 2013 was around the corner, which was going to transform the way company law and all the things around that function. It brought in criminality and jail term for key management personnel, director. It brought in additional accountability and responsibility for directors, independent directors, board members, and so on. The chalta hai, hota hai, dekh lenge, manage kar lenge was not going to work anymore. Globally, there was a lot more focus on governance, risk, and compliance. Indian corporations were going global. A lot of Indian companies were buying companies around the world, and vice versa was also happening. Globalization was becoming the in thing. Governance, risk, and compliance was starting to play a big role in fundraisers, both equity and debt. Shareholders were putting a premium on well managed and well governed companies. All of these things were happening. But how do you do that? You do it by having strong processes internally. And Indian companies continue to operate in ad hoc, manual, paper-based, and people-dependent compliance program. When we looked around, scanned the landscape, we realized that there was nobody in the country who was solving this problem. So while in the 90s, our country and companies adopted a lot of technology around ERPs and so on, and they went ahead and automated their accounting, and then came a wave where the ERP softwares became the talk of the town. Then came CRMs, HRMS, payroll systems. So companies continue to invest extensively in automating and digitizing, how while we were late to the party as a country, but companies were continuing to invest, compliance became an afterthought. Nobody was thinking of doing this differently than they were. And that laid the foundation of thinking about why don't we get together and solve this problem. And that laid the foundation stone for Avantis. And it has been 8 years since we started.
No, that's fantastic. You mentioned a problem worth solving, and one thing that is apparent with compliance is that it's an inescapable problem, right? I mean, it's something that everyone has to confront, and also it's a very ubiquitous problem, irrespective of what business, what industry you are in. It's something that you have to work with as well.
So, Carrie, there is an interesting saying, right? Death and taxes are inescapable, right?
Of course.
I would add compliance to that.
Yeah, and that's manifoldly complicated if you operate out of India, right? And we'll discuss a few things with respect to that further in the conversation. But take us through some of the key milestones, since your founding. What has been the journey like, and you got acquired by Team Lease, and how did that change things?
Very interesting journey. Lot of roller coaster rides. At least a few times, I would say at least 10 times, where I felt that we had run our course and we were going to fold up, go belly up, and we would not make the next month's payroll. Right. So while from the outside in, entrepreneurship looks great, it looks very glamorous. When we look at all these billion-dollar unicorns and enterprises, it's very exciting and inspiring. Once you take on that journey, is when you realize that it is anything but that simple. So there were so many occasions during the course of few years where we felt that we were not going to be able to make the next payroll. There were so many times I felt that in spite of all the best intentions, efforts, we are not making the progress that we thought we would make. So, those were some key areas. In general, Indian customers, they don't like paying for technology in general, right? So while that trend has changed, but the kind of investment that you see in the Western world by corporates, Indian corporates still have a long way to go. Because India, you can buy people, throw warm bodies at problems. Efficiency and productivity take a backseat. And that's where I felt that when you cater to India as a market, the technology adoption life cycle is longer than what you see in Europe and the Western world. So that was one of the key areas. Second, hiring talent is another one big area. A lot of youngsters, of course, the trends have changed in the last few years since we started, but talented young people wanted to work for large multinational known brand names. And if you are a 50, 60 people organization, not having a great brand name, in spite of the fact that you may be offering great, interesting, challenging work, you don't end up becoming an attractive work option. So attracting talent was a big issue that we constantly grappled with. The third major area was regulatory environment. India is very complex, very ill-defined. There's hardly any documentation available anywhere. Nobody had done any digital codification of acts. You look at an act, it can go into tens of pages with complex legalese. Reading it and then converting that into applicable compliances was a big challenge. There was no database available which was digitized, classified, acts, compliances, filings, returns, registers, challans, categories, departments, ministries. So we ended up investing a lot of our firepower into putting that together, which was the basic plumbing required. So these were, in my opinion, some of the key challenges that we went through early on.
Right. And I think that, you've come a long way on all of those fronts, right? And India itself has come a long way on all of those fronts, I would say, right? You're right. I mean, Indian customers don't prefer to pay for intangibles, whether that's technology or consulting and advisory or whatever else, right? But you're seeing that.
Funnily enough, Carrie, I have encountered CFOs who would look at me in the eye and say, "You've already built this technology, right?" So you should just distribute it free. Why would you charge for it?
Of course.
And I would look at them in the face and I'm like, really?
If only it was that simple.
Yeah.
Right. And these days, fresh grads as well, college grads, and generally, I mean, people do prefer working with startups. Startups have become sexy over the last 10 years, right? And even on the digitization front as well, I mean, I think we've made we've come leaps and bounds, right? We've really leapfrogged into the future, especially what happened last year, right? So let's shift our gaze towards compliance in India, which is a topic that not a lot of people have enough information about, and maybe this podcast could throw some light on some aspects, right? So in your opinion, what are some principles for navigating compliance in India? I know it's a very broad question, but if you could also talk about how companies can build good governance practices early on, right, when they're still let's say a seed or a Series A startup, and if you could talk about some thumb rules with respect to all of these, that could be super helpful.
Sure. So I think let me answer that question in a couple of parts. The first part, let's understand what are we talking about when we talk about regulatory environment. What does it actually mean? Right. So India has one of the most complex regulatory environments in the world. Believe it or not, the country has 1,536 acts with close to 70,000 compliances that affect entrepreneurs. No single company gets to comply with all of these. But if I break it down, if I peel this onion for you, a small company with just one HO, which is head office, and one plant, today deals with anywhere between 700 to 900 compliances, give or take, in a year. 700 to 900 compliances with a few hundred filings, which includes variety of returns, maintenance of various kinds of registers, payments, remittances, different kinds of licenses, registrations, permissions. There are many kinds of displays, exemptions. When you look at all of these, the complexity just multiplies. I've done some basic math, and a given company deals with 3 to 4 compliances on a day, on a daily basis, for about 250 business days in a year. Such a company deals with at least one return a day, uh, many registers in a month. And this cannot be done by itself because the kind of expertise that is required to deal with this is humongous. Take the example of your home state, Cary, which is Karnataka. You know that there are 1,440 different permutations of minimum wages that are available in the state, just one
These
state.
Yeah, these numbers always astound me, Rishi.
And this is just one state, right? So if you are operating in more than one state, and every state has its own permutations and combinations,
Yeah.
imagine the numbers that you're dealing with. So you really need help. Manual ways don't work anymore. In spite of best intentions, you are going to miss compliances. The cost of poor compliance, the cost of missed compliance, unfortunately, in India has shot up dramatically. What worked earlier doesn't work anymore. A company that has an ambition of growing needs to figure out ways to manage this. And that's a fundamental problem that we are attempting to solve. If you look at the last few years in India, the rates of growth have been astounding. Our Prime Minister has laid a target of getting to a $5 trillion economy in the next few years, and then a $10 trillion economy by the end of the decade. If this has to be accomplished, every company has to grow, and they have to grow rapidly. That's how this will be done, because we have 63 million enterprises Cary in the country, out of which only 22,000 odd have a paid up share capital of more than 10 crores. Only 70,000 odd have a revenue of greater than $1 million. So if you look at it, our 63 million enterprises translate into a lot of economic dwarfs. If these companies, 70,000, have to grow rapidly, they have to learn to deal with compliance. And the numbers have to come down, the complexity has to come down, and that cannot happen unless digitization, rationalization, and simplification happens across the board.
Right. So quick follow up on that, Rishi. You mentioned digitization and so on. And since we're dealing with the government in most cases, right? I mean, Um, have you seen that change within the government processes itself, that they've adopted more digital and they've tried to make things simpler?
Yeah, absolutely. The intention is absolutely there. The effort is there, but I think it's a long journey and it will take a while. So I'll give you some examples, Carrie.
Right.
Did you know that there are 2,233 government websites today in India which publish regulatory changes? Now, why? I'll tell you, there is a good news and a bad news.
Right.
The good news is that all of these government agencies, whether they are at central, state, union territory, or municipal corporation level, at least now they have put up a website where they put a regulatory change. 90-95% of the country's regulatory changes get published on these websites. Tell
Right.
me what is the bad news? The bad
Uh,
news is none of them have any subscription. You
okay.
genuinely needed to know what changed. The onus is on you to go to the, first of all, know the URL.
Right.
Then every website is designed differently. Every website is very complex to navigate. It is not easy to do any search on these websites. You have to know which button to click, which tab to go, which submenu to select, from there, how to navigate to the page. And you have to do it many times if you want to stay compliant, because you don't know when a
Mm.
new change is going to appear.
So it's
So
only marginally better than a circular or some change in a registrar somewhere.
no, I would give that credit to the government. So
Right.
the fact is that we have gone digital and we have put these websites.
Right.
But the fact also remains that there is a long way to go, because the current system is inefficient. It does not give the right information to the right person at the right time when required, so
Mm.
that they can make a right decision. It still creates information asymmetry. If I happen to go to one of those websites as a part of my daily routine, clicked on something and stumbled upon a change, then you will be accidentally compliant. You won't be compliant by design.
Right.
I think digitization has come a long way from where we were. But as I said, there is still a very long way to go. We are
Right.
nowhere close to the utopia. I'll give you a parallel example here. If you look at National Payment Corporation of India, right, NPCI, it can be taken as a case study in itself. Just a few years ago, there were a handful of digital transactions, digital payment transactions. NPCI created UPI. Multiple private vendors went ahead and implemented UPI, converted it into their own apps like the Phone Pays and the Google Pays and so on. And they created incentive system for people to adopt. That is the same blueprint that we have to adopt for digitization at a government level, because government is never going to have enough resources to build this technology ground up, manage it, maintain it, fund it, and keep it current. But private enterprises can. But unfortunate part is private enterprises won't build technology unless government has done the basic plumbing, which happened by NPCI building some of this technology.
Right.
I think that's the model that we will have to continue to take, where there is a PPP or public-private partnership, which needs to get done. Government has to build the core plumbing or core infrastructure, and it needs to incentivize the private sector to come leverage the core plumbing and build technology so that they can create apps for users, incentivize them for adoption, and take digitization to a whole new level.
Yeah. No, that's a great point that you bring up, right? And something that we've spoken about earlier also is that, what are the incentives to formalize or be compliant from an entrepreneur's perspective, right? What does he or she get? I mean, they just get a bunch of people after them, right? I mean, so there's really no incentive as such. But if you look at how technology has changed of late, NPCI is a very good example of that and so on, right? I mean, there are actually services to gain from that, right? And that's a very good example of building incentives for being compliant and
So, let me take a detour here, Carrie. No, I mentioned 63 million enterprises. Let's break down 63 and I'll tell you what are the incentives or disincentives here. 63 million enterprises in India, only 1 million are registered for Social Security, which basically means they pay ESI and PF. Out of 1 million, only 500,000 are active contributors to ESI and PF. The other 500,000 don't pay anything actively. They are probably languishing out there. Out of 500,000, only 70,000 have revenues greater than 5 crores. And out of them, 22,500 have a paid up share capital of 10 crores. And only 8, 9,000 or somewhere in that range are listed companies on NSE and BSE. So one of the biggest problems that we've had is the current regulatory scheme or regime creates disincentives for formalization. Let's take a company which is 19 people versus 21 people. If you're 19 employees, you can escape PF. If you're 21, you have to now get enrolled for PF. Suddenly, a lot of other stuff comes in. The moment you become formal enterprise, the PAN, the GST numbers, you become a private company, the SIN, the TAN, a whole bunch of things come in. And like Amitabh Bachchan movie was there, right? ये सीढ़ियां ऊपर तो जाती हैं लेकिन नीचे नहीं आती. It's very easy to enroll yourself in some of these. Right. And it is literally impossible, very, very difficult to come out of them. In developed world, they have figured out a way to help entrepreneurs try, take a risk. If things work, great, you grow bigger. If things don't work, you can quickly turn back and nullify and close down your shop and move forward. In India, you want to surrender your PF number, ESI number, try that. There's a whole laundry list of documents that you need to do. Each one of them have an interdependency on another one. Until you hire consultants who will charge you a lot of money, there is no simple way of getting this done. So, I mean, that's really what we are talking about here.
Yeah. No, and that's another very good point that you bring up, right? Oftentimes when we talk about ease of doing business and so on, right? And people bring up the fact that it's just a nightmarish process to shut down a company in India, right? If shutting down a private limited is perhaps only marginally easier than, starting a private company in that sense. Or perhaps, the other way around.
Shutting down is more difficult.
More difficult, correct. Yeah. So why is that the case? Do we blame this on bureaucracy? Do we blame this on a lack of intent? Or is the system itself, flawed in some sense? What needs to change in order for this to get better?
Just so you know, right? And you would agree with me that the world around us has transformed enormously in the last decade. Right? But do you know that most of our labor laws were written around independence, some of them pre-independence?
Yeah.
Right? Now, you see in the last 10 years, so many new employment models have come up, gig being one of the most talked about in the recent times. Work from home has become, instrumental for at least the white-collared workers in times of pandemic, right? There are so many women who drop out of the workforce because traditional work models don't cater to a part-time or a work from home or temporary worker kind of a requirement. Unfortunately, a lot of our laws have been written at a point in time when they were required, but they have lost relevance over a period of time because the world around us has changed, its requirements have changed, the technology, its penetration, all of these things have changed. But the rules and laws, they have failed to adapt. Do you know that a small manufacturer today can get inspected by 13 different inspectors just from labor laws? Different kinds of inspectors under different acts. They can show up at your doorstep at any time. Officially, they can inspect you once every 6 months. Doesn't matter whether you have been showing a history of compliance or a fraud. They can show up at your doorstep. They can ask you any question. They can take a round of your premises. Now, a small entrepreneur needs time to focus on his business. He needs to be relieved of all of these responsibilities so that they can grow the business. Of course, I'm not saying take away the compliance. We need to keep them accountable. They need to pay their dues to their workers, to their country in taxes and so on. But there are easier and better ways of doing that. The developed world has figured out how to help a company get incorporated in 4 hours. Our company still takes a few weeks, if not a few months. A factory in India, if I have an intention to start manufacturing in India, it can take me anywhere from 2 to 4 months to get basic permits and basic licenses, right from an NOC from a fire department and another NOC from electrical department and a registration with this and a project report with this. All of these are different bodies. They have their own fiefdoms, they have their own turf. They have their own rules. Nobody is incentivized to incentivize this entrepreneur to go and do something rapidly and quickly because it will create jobs. Everybody can say no. No one person can say yes. The whole operating philosophy is prohibited until permitted. We have to reverse it, change some of these fundamentally. Only then we will see a significant shift in the way job creation is happening in the country.
Right. I think much of this stems from the perception that, businessmen chore hai, right? And, the 100% of us suffer from maybe the 5 or 10 or maybe 15% who could be, who would have malintentions or who could be deviant and who could be exceptional cases, right? And pretty much if you look at laws and policies, they're drafted to penalize everyone for the sake of those 5 or 10% people.
I won't agree with that 100%. One of the fundamental differences between the West and India is that in West, you can't get away with stuff. In most part, of course, exceptions are always there. But more often than not, if you get caught, you will be penalized, you will be punished. Traditionally in India, the approach has been dekh lenge, manage kar lenge. Manage ho jata hai. With that approach, people don't feel the heat when they get engrossed in these corrupt practices, because they feel there is a way out because I can manage. In the West, more often than not, if you get stuck, if you get caught, then you've had it. Like, for example, take the recent COVID scenario in Delhi and oxygen crisis. And every now and then you hear about people hoarding oxygen cylinders. People hoard because they know if they get caught, they will be able to somehow manage their way out, wriggle out of this condition. Imagine a scenario where they knew that if they get caught, they will be behind bars for 20 years. I can tell you, 70-80% of the people, they don't want to cross over on the other side. They cross over because they feel, koi kuch nahi hota, everybody is doing it. You make a few cases where people realize that this is unacceptable, and if you engage in this bad behavior, you've had it. I think the behaviors in India will also start changing.
Right.
And that's where, when you say 5% of the errant, I don't agree that it's 5%. Given half a chance, half the population of the country would engage in practices to avoid taxes, to evade taxes, I should say. You can always avoid taxes because avoiding taxes is legal. Right. You can use the premises that the government has given to avoid taxes, but evading taxes is not legal, right? And that's where, given half a chance, I think a large portion of the population would engage in that. But our enforcement structure has to become stronger. As a country, we have to make a few cases where people realize that this behavior is not going to work. Like we've had recent bankruptcies where media trial happened for some of the people. A lot of ignominy came. And now a lot of people who think of defaulting on their loans realize that they can become the next icon and have a lot of ignominy coming to them for all the wrong reasons. Once you make those cases, I think the borderline cases will start doing the right thing.
Right.
But you're right, the laws have been written with prohibited until permitted model, and that attitude has to change, because not everybody is out there to steal and fraud. Not everybody wants to act like the angry young man movies of Amitabh Bachchan, where all the businessmen and all the industrialists were corrupt and they wanted to steal the rights of the workers. Times have changed. Our socialist fabric also has changed. The way we look at life, jobs, the importance of public sector in our lives. A lot of people now want to work for private sector in spite of knowing that it's a risky choice. Earlier, public sector was a highly desirable job, not as much anymore. So everything around us is changing, and this attitude also has to change. And that's where processes, systems, digitization has to come in. I'll give you another example. For credit, today, if you want to go get a home loan, there's something called a credit score, right? Whoever you go and approach for your loan can quickly pick up a credit report for you and know what is your past credit behavior and decide whether they want to extend the loan to you or not. Government needs to come up with a system like that in compliance as well. Don't bother an honest businessman. And for that, the only way you can do so is by establishing their history and knowing how many times a person has deviated from a normal compliance behavior. So we need to put risk-based compliance, risk-based inspections processes in place so that you're going after the corrupt more often than you're going after the honest. Today, you're shooting in the dark. You'll go and inspect anybody and everybody. There are no processes and systems to manage a compliance behavior and know whether somebody is green on compliance traditionally or red on compliance traditionally. So the inspector's behavior has to change. But for that change to happen, we need to have these plumbing, basic infrastructure pieces in place.
Yeah. No, you bring out the point really well, right? Which is that there is no incentive for the honest entrepreneur, the businessman, and at the same time, I mean, he sees that the really corrupt people are sort of getting away, and with that whole chalta hai, and we can adjust this and so on and so forth. We've spoken about this as well, and you mentioned this that there's a lot of information asymmetry in the domain that you operate, right? Keeping up with all of these different changes. You brought up the websites. I mean, 2000 plus websites, even if, per day, some 3 or 4 of these change, right? And it's...
Oh, per day, 3, 4 don't change.
Right.
So countries saw 4,500 changes in the last 1 year.
Oh my God. Right.
So there were at least 12 to 13 changes on a daily basis on an average.
Right. So that's an insane amount of information to keep up with, right? So I just want to check. So how do you deal with this? And that could also be actually your advantage in some sense. That could be a moat as well, because people don't understand these nuances, and they would really like for someone to simplify this, right? So broadly, operating in this domain, how do you keep up with all these changes?
Few things, right? There's technology at the forefront. We have leveraged extensive amount of technology in artificial intelligence, machine learning, various kinds of cryptographic algorithms, OCR algorithms. A lot of technology we have built internally in order to keep up. At the same time, we built deep domain capabilities. What we do is compliance, and compliance comes from these 1536 acts. All of them have a lot of legalese written into it. So we have a team of about 55 to 60 dedicated lawyers focused on just upkeeping this database, which is not easy because there's so many fields in this database. Which act, which section, which paragraph, what compliance, what ramifications of non-compliance, fixed penalties, variable penalties, one-time penalties, repeat offense penalties, various reference texts, definitions, forms, sample forms that are required for filing the compliance, periodicities built in there, rates of calculation, rates of penalties, rates of interest. All of these are examples of how complex this is. So we have leveraged technology extensively, digitized this whole thing, put detailed classifications of categories of compliances, types of compliances, levels of compliances, penalties, financial, non-financial, imprisonment, all of this over a period of time. As we gained experience working with over 1,000 companies in India, we kept enhancing and investing in technology. So on one hand, lawyers were educating us on what this data is and what did it mean, and technology was taking that cue and digitizing all of these, converting them into easily searchable, sortable, filterable information, which could be meta tagged, and RDB, BMS, NoSQL databases could work with this data so that this could become actionable and meaningful. So it's taken us a few years to get this far, but it's a combination of technology and domain being married together to solve a specific problem.
Right. Very interesting. The other aspect is that it's a highly fragmented environment, right? I mean, each state has its own complexity, and there are various players in this domain who are solving it their own way, right? I mean, some through products and some through services. How are you able to stand out amidst the crowd and help your customers tune out the noise and actually choose you?
So it's not too difficult, Carrie. most companies, they focus on features, whereas I have focused on experience of the client. When you digitize a complex business process, you're not selling to a highly tech savvy person. A typical organization has tens of users, and you can broadly classify them into a few early adopters, lot of them somewhere in the middle, and a few laggards. When you build technology for enterprises in India, especially which is used by a broad-based audience, you need to make sure that that technology works for all three classes of audience. Otherwise, if just 10 people out of 100, they are early adopters and they can use your technology well, then the other 90 are not going to be able to use it so well. In which case, within a few weeks, the compliance dashboards will be out of tune and suddenly will not make sense for the management. And before you know, they will stop using your product. So one big differentiator is to make it fairly intuitive, user-friendly. And one thing that I have done extensively at Avantis is to leverage the services of designers who can design for customer experience. We have spent a lot of time in persona identification. Who's the user? What is his personality? What is his or her tech savviness? What are the use cases that they deal with? What are the core use cases and boundary conditions? Where things fall through the cracks? What are the reasons why they will stop using it? What are the use cases that we should build so that they use it extensively and they feel like coming back to it? How should we solve them so that in a few clicks they can do what they need to do? All of these are questions that we have worked on making sure that our development, our technology team asks themselves before they put any technology out there. It's not just about packing in the features. It is about making them usable to solve a real business problem. So that's one. Second, we constantly focus on making our developers and development team and technology staff understand the problem of the end users. Sometimes what happens in majority of the cases, I feel developers don't think knowing the business is their core problem. They just think coding is their core problem. But unfortunately, technology has no value on its own 2 feet. It solves real world business problem. So until your developers, your technology, testing, and other teams realize what problem they are solving, they are going to do a shoddy job of solving that problem. So we spend a lot of time and energy on sensitizing our development staff, our technology teams, and making sure they understand who their client is and what problem are they solving and how their day goes by, so that we can design technology which our customers love to use.
Right. Now, one of the things is how do you scale certain features or workflows and so on, right? I mean, because uh, inherently there are so many differences in compliance workflows and processes, even state-wise, as we discussed, right? So, how do you productize some of this stuff? I mean, can you explain, what your thinking is with respect to like a roadmap and stuff like that?
Sure. So, Carrie, we today work with over 1,500 entities in India, right? And these entities are spread across 43 different industries. So, we work from e-commerce on one side to textile on the other. We work with pharmaceutical on one side to auto component manufacturer on the other. So when we work with companies across the spectrum, every company, whether it's private limited, listed, public limited, LLP, proprietorship, partnership, or a combination of them, they have their own unique experiences and challenges that they bring to the fore. One culture we created early on is never ignore a comment, a question, or a support requirement of a customer. There is a problem hidden there which we may not be seeing because it may be in our blind spot. So if a customer has asked a question, if they've given you some input, if they are highlighting an item that we don't do in our product, listen to them very carefully, go ask more probing and deeper questions, open up that can of worms which most companies try to avoid, to learn as to why they are asking this question and what is the hidden thing that we are not seeing as a company. You do it over a few years, and many people in the company do it over a few years, you will realize that not just the core use cases, you've started solving all the boundary conditions also, which are impediments or roadblocks to adoption of a technology product. So that's one thing that we have done very differently, where everything that we do, we learn from our clients because they are the practitioners. We are the providers. We don't have the ground level understanding that they bring to the table. So we listen to them, we understand it, we bake it into the product in such a way that everything becomes configurable in the end. Our goal here is not to write a new piece of code unless it is absolutely required. Everything should be so personalizable, customizable, configurable without writing a piece of code, so that self-service features are enhanced and customers can use those self-service features to serve themselves. It serves two problems. So I think, Carrie, the magic there is to build technology which is reusable, to build technology which is usable, where adoption is natural because your user interface is intuitive, where technology is highly available. Customers don't have to think कि रात को 3 बजे उठ के अगर मेरे को access करना है तो there will be a problem. They should be able to access it anytime, anywhere. Right. If something went wrong, you should be able to recover it within no time. There has to be resilience built into it. It has to be available on mobile. Believe it or not, half the world takes a mobile phone to their toilet also these days. That's how they're glued to their mobile. So if your enterprise product is not available on your mobile, you have a problem right there. Right. So I think these are core to building technology that can be leveraged, that people love using, and as an organization, you can maintain it with minimal cost investment.
Right. No, that's great to hear. I mean, in some sense, you're building with the customer, right? The customer is telling you exactly what he or she needs, and you're building with the customer. And
in most cases, Carrie, customers don't tell us what they need. They
right.
tell us about a problem they are experiencing.
Right.
And when we dig deeper, when we ask probing questions, leading questions, right, we together unearth a larger problem in most cases.
Correct. Right.
And then you need to have commitment to solve those problems. When you see garbage, you need to be willing to shovel that garbage out and clean that mess. And over a period of time, you keep cleaning mess time and time again. And over a period of time, you build decent technology.
Right. Yeah, one thing that comes through in what you're saying is the amount of customer centricity you have, right? I mean, it's clear that you build around the customer, build with the customer, as you were just talking about. Another product.
I'll share one important item with you there.
Yeah.
I actually personally continue to do a number of demos even today. While I have a sizable sales team, field sales team, we have about 15, 16 people in our sales organization today, and all of them reasonably well trained, senior enough with an executive presence to deal with sales. But I insist on doing certain number of demos even today, just so that I can operate with my eyes and ears close to the ground, because that's how I get to know what customers are talking about, where the issues are. I personally get involved in a lot of closures also, where when we close, customers come to the table with what they would like customized, what they would like changed, modified, and all of that. And that's where I learn a lot about where the product roadmaps have to be created, how they need to be moving forward, where the engagement issues are likely to be, and what should our technology look like in quarters and years to come.
No, that's amazing, actually, for a CEO to be able to do demos, right? So,
I don't think it should be an option for most CEOs of startups, right? I mean, I don't consider us to be anywhere close to the utopia. It's a journey of 1,000 miles, and I think we have covered maybe 10 miles so far in the last 6-7 years. I think we will cover the remaining in years to come. And if that has to happen, and I'm not talking about just our company, but startup CEOs who are looking to transform a space which is not well defined, they need to be very close to the customer and the problem. Otherwise, they'll get lost in the maze of just marketing or internal management, and over a period of time, you will become a mediocre organization.
Right. No, I think it's very important to sort of complete the loop, right? I mean, complete that feedback loop, and who better to tell you than prospects and customers, right?
Absolutely.
For sure. Because I think you do have a point. I mean, otherwise you end up, drinking your own Kool-Aid in some sense, right? So,
yeah.
Yeah. So, one aspect of your work also involves, as we discussed, working with a lot of government information processes, and you scrape this from, let's say their websites, some PDFs, and so on and so forth. Have you sort of built any utilities for this? Like, is there any effort to reuse some of this data and information, maybe make it shareable through APIs and so on?
Yeah, sure. If you go to our website at avantis.co.in today, it's India's only portal which offers you national, personalized, comprehensive, and real-time regulatory updates from 2,233 websites. Most companies would have decided to keep it proprietary and not share it on their website because nobody else has this. We've built technology, we've invested heavily in building this. But at some point, we decided that we are not just a company, we are a company and a cause. So the least we need to do is make some of this shareable so that customers, when I say customers, I'm talking about vast majority of Indian enterprises, they can come to our website, they can look for a regulatory update, they can use some basic parameters and subscribe to newsletters so that without even paying us a penny, they can start benefiting from the work that we have been doing. So that is something that we are really proud of. And we send out a few lakh newsletters a month today to thousands of customers who don't pay us a penny. But I think Rashtra Nirman or Desh Kalyan mein, this is the least I can do today.
Amazing. So, I mean, product companies are generally squeamish about building a services, business within the company, right? And but that's something that you have done really well. So, Avantis's product is enabled by consulting services. So, I was, just wondering what was the thinking behind this, right? And how has that helped you serve your customer better?
So, Carrie, customers don't like half-hearted solutions, right? They don't like partial solutions. The stickiness comes when they can give something to you and not worry about it, right? You give a small portion of a solution to a small problem that they have, they are going to be happy about it, but they are not going to be adopting it with all the happiness that is required. So over a period of time, we've realized that one of the big binding constraints of companies is they don't even know what compliances they are supposed to be following. Forget following them. So first step we decided is how do we make sure that there is a baseline assessment of what they need to comply with. And we ended up building a lot of deep capabilities in applicability assessment. That's not an option anymore. When we deploy our product, I often use the word GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. I tell CFOs and executives there that unless you have a decent baseline of what you need to be following, a great looking dashboard is not going to be of much rescue because you're probably doing 30-40% of what you need to be doing. So this is a great opportunity. You're adopting a digital platform. Why not do it with full vigor? Do an applicability assessment before you actually go live. So that's a big service that we started. A lot of companies say, listen, you have given me a great self-service platform. My teams have been using it. How do I know that a year from now we are still compliant?
Right.
So we said, you know
So,
what?
so the problem is not just going from A to B, but the problem is even figuring out which way you have to go, right?
Absolutely. And compliance is a journey, it's not a destination, right? I tell this to a lot of our prospects and many workshops that I do. Every morning when you wake up and come back to work, there is a new challenge on compliance staring at you in the face. Either something that you're doing has changed and you need to know what has changed and comply, or something new is on the horizon and you need to keep your eyes and ears open so that you know what is going to come and start preparing for it. Just like risk managers, right? So from that point of view, every day is a new day. Treat it as a journey, not a destination. Keep your eyes and ears open. Subscribe to the right inputs so that you can stay on top of your game and continue to invest in building a culture of compliance. A lot of companies, they fail to build a culture of compliance. They think hiring one compliance officer has solved their compliance problems. Unfortunately, they don't realize that that one individual lady or gentleman does not have anybody reporting into them, right? An HR head does not report to them, the finance head does not report to them, the factory head does not report to them, company secretary does not report to them. So you're asking that individual to become a compliance officer, but nobody reports to them. So it's very important to build processes which can bring in the required transparency, accountability, timeliness, traceability, thereby leading to larger control. And that's what most organizations fail to do. I spend a lot of my time talking to companies and their executives and board members, talking about how do you institutionalize the culture of compliance so that it's not accidental, it is not sporadic, but it becomes the DNA of the organization.
Right. Let's take a slight detour on that note, right? I mean, we've made the point about why compliance has to be prioritized, and there's a significant downside to not doing that, right? But I do, feel for people driving compliance at organizations, because oftentimes they're seen as bottlenecks to everything, right? So how does one inspire, as you mentioned, a culture of compliance, right? And what does the founder or the leadership team do in order for people to understand and empathize with this poor person who has to drive compliance?
So I'll give you a simple example. 9 out of 10 times when I ask a CEO whether you are compliant, they look at the sky, they count the cobwebs in the room. Hesitatingly, they'll say, I think we are compliant. And my follow up question to them is, why do you think you're compliant? And you won't realize their answer. The answer is because we don't have any legal notice right now. So the proxy of being compliant is lack of a show cause notice waiting at your doorstep. When I probe deeper and ask them, how many compliances do you think you have in the corporation? And these are for large companies, right? Most CEOs say 100, 200, 300. Whereas a very small company with simple one manufacturing plant, Carry, today has 700 to 800 compliances. And as you grow from a single entity, single location, single business to a much larger entity with multi-locational, multi-business, the number of compliances go through the roof. For a decent sized large company in India, the number of compliances are upwards of 10,000 a year. 10,000 compliances is what you're dealing with, and their CEOs still think that they have 200, 300, 400 compliance. I've never come across a CEO, and I've come across hundreds of them in the last few years, who has given me a number of more than 200, 300. That's their understanding. So first thing that has to change is the executive, the tone from the top has to change. Executives have to start focusing more on compliance, not because this brings revenue, but because this can mean a death knell to their enterprise. Lack of compliance today can wreak havoc to an organization. Believe it or not, an organization of 10 years ago versus today, the world has changed. Today, there is social media all over the place. One non-compliance, one issue, suddenly it gets amplified, not because you like to do it, but because there are so many people, unfortunately, talking about it on all the social media. They've democratized information flow. You can't just go and do damage control just like that. A brand which takes years to build can be broken, can be shattered within no time because of poor compliances that somebody may have just highlighted, either your customers, prospects, users, or sometimes even your own internal people. So it's very, very important that the tone of the top changes. CEOs, CXOs, board members start paying attention to that. They bring processes in place so that once a month in the management meet, they can see a comprehensive dashboard and a report which clearly highlights that we had 800 compliances due this month, 745 have been done in time, 40 were done, but they were done delayed. Whatever 15, 20, whatever is left is overdue. And these 15, 20, 4 of them are critical risk, which can send us to jail. 8 of them are high risk, where we can have a lockdown, and the others are low in risk. And what are we going to do about those 4 and those 8? If until organization has a culture like this, believe it or not, you're sitting on a ticking time bomb, and it's going to explode someday. And suddenly you will be dealing with show cause notices, penalties, retrospective penalties mounting. Suddenly your shareholders will become wary of your internal processes. Share price will take a hit. Your cost of raising debt capital might go up. All of these are ramifications of poor compliance in the company.
Right.
So first step is let the executives pay attention to it. Second, make sure the goals are aligned to compliance. There are a lot of people who play a role in compliance. Make sure that they have their annual goals reflecting their compliance goals also. Their incentive system, their hikes, their ratings need to have a role of their ability to comply in time, their ability to stay on top, actively pay attention to what is going on in the regulatory environment, and so on. Third, continuous learning and training needs to become the need of the hour. In India, compliance changes 4,500 times a year. A typical organization would get affected at least by 800 to 1,000 changes, which means on a 250-day business year basis, 3 to 4 changes are affecting your company on a day-to-day basis. So there has to be a culture of continuous learning. L&D departments have to facilitate some of this so that you can always provide education. And last thing, have a compliance audit at least once a year. You won't believe so many gaps come up, and it gives you an opportunity to go intervene, correct those situations, sometimes pay fine and penalty and go and comply later. But it creates visibility for the management. You're not caught blind. You know what is the risk at a given point in time, and you have an opportunity to correct it before the department comes and gives you a show cause notice. So I think those are a few things that I think companies need to do differently to create a culture of compliance.
Right. And what would you say to a typical startup founder or leadership person who's listening to all of this and thinking, what, ye sab to bade log ka kaam hai. I mean, it's not relevant for me yet, right? What would you say to such a person? I personally feel that startups, especially those that are reinventing business models, right? Like, we referenced the gig working economy, for example, or work from home, which is prevalent right now, right? Have to deal with new things, right? So what would you say to startup founders and operators who are listening to this?
See, one of the things that startup founders do really well is solve a good problem, right? And solve it really well. And they focus constantly on raising funds, raising their valuations, and focusing on scale. One thing they don't realize is compliance is a key binding constraint to scale. So if you have a company with a multi-state presence today, you're going and starting offices left, right, and center, whether they are retail stores in some cases, or your sales or branch offices in some other cases, or support centers or warehouses, or supply chain elements as the case might be. Each one of them are governed by a string of central, state, and local laws. And you go and mindlessly expand all of this with scant focus to compliance. Guess what? You're sitting on a ticking time bomb. And before you know, the regulator will come and you will have to press the brakes. A lot of your bandwidth will go in dealing with this. A lot of money will go in hiring expensive lawyers who will represent you. All of this is not required. Just pay attention to this as much as you pay attention to other aspects, and compliance will become an enabler rather than a binding constraint for your growth. I work with so many e-commerce companies today, and believe it or not, Carrie, some of them come to us not because they wanted to manage their compliance, but because the regulators slapped a tight notice in their face. And suddenly their investors looked at them and said, I thought you were in compliance, and I'm finding you out of compliance. And that's where they start scrambling and looking for solutions. So being in this spot firsthand, I can see that behavior from so many high growth startups. And this is a mistake. They need to actively look at it, invest the right amount of time, effort, energy, and money in this. And by the way, the money that we are talking is not huge. I mean, if you spend 5 to 10 lakhs a year, you are in good space. There are enough and more tools available to you, and enough and more experts available at your disposal who can help you. So in the larger scheme of things, when you're trying to do hundreds of crores or thousands of crores in revenue and raising hundreds of millions of dollars, 10, 15 lakhs here and there is pocket change for some of these companies. So they need to pay attention. They need to be sensitive to the fact that this can become a binding constraint before too long.
Yeah. And especially because it's such a nebulous space, right? I mean, policy for these kind of businesses is still evolving, and you would rather be proactive on this front than wait on it, and then some government officer somewhere finds you out of line, and you have to, then you're in a position where you're reacting to something rather than taking charge of things, right? So
totally agree. Totally agree. So, but at the same time, I would say up to a point, these compliances need to be few and far between. After you've established that you are a going concern and you will survive and you have enough ramp, is when some of these need to kick off. An early stage entrepreneur working with 2, 4, 5, 6 people, I don't think they need to be bothered with compliance. They need to do their core job, which is solving a problem worth solving it really well. But once they get to a point where they now know they are going to scale out, is when they need to start paying attention to this.
Typically, what is the stage of the company when they have to prioritize?
When they get to Series A, I mean, that's
Series A,
when you
okay.
know that they are raising decent capital. Now they are going to invest in building teams, building sales and marketing capability, expanding their geographical footprint from more than one location. All of these are signs and symptoms for a company to know that time has come that they need to start taking this seriously and making this a part of their management and board conversations.
Right. So, Rishi, last year, I'm sure you would agree, was an exceptional time for all businesses, right? The pandemic changed all of our businesses and industries, right? So, how did things change for you specifically? And, what are some of the key lessons you learned?
See, if I were to encapsulate the answer in one line, Carrie, I would say short-term pain for the long-term gain. One thing which became evident to a large portion of India is digitization is the way to go, right? Zoom, the Google Hangouts, Microsoft Teams became household names overnight. The world of technology, in my opinion, was brought forward by a decade, if at all. The edtechs went through the roof because the world suddenly took to technology like fish to water. And this trend is only going to get amplified as we move forward. So a lot more digital investments will continue to happen. However, with that said, when you are in the moment, the world doesn't look that rosy because customers defer discretionary expense. What we do carry is transform compliance, right? Nobody gasps for breath for transformation of compliance. We make transparency, accountability, ownership, we bring control, but they can survive without some of this. They've been surviving all this time, so they can survive another 6 months. So short-term pain because some organizations, some of our prospects, they deferred expenses, they postponed purchases, and that hurt in short term. But as soon as the first wave got over, we came into October, November. Suddenly, we saw the horse bolt out of the stable and a lot of new inquiries coming in because customers suddenly realized that managing compliance with so many people operating from home in a paper-based, people-dependent, ad hoc, manual process where some clerk was moving paper from one table to the other doesn't work as effectively. So I think my short answer is really that long term, I think we as a business, along with all digital businesses, will gain massively. But in short term, just like everybody else bled, we also bled.
Right. Yeah, and I think, I've been talking to founders as well on the podcast for almost a year, more than that, in fact. And it's a similar story everywhere, right? I mean, the pandemic has sort of forced people to innovate, and it's made a lot of businesses more robust, I would say, right? And,
Yeah.
as and when this time is past, and growth is back, I think we'll all be in a better position to leverage that, right? So, Rishi, this has been a fascinating conversation. We've uncovered various nuances of compliance and, and things to that effect, right? My last question to you is, again, a very broad question. If you would imagine a $5 trillion economy, what should compliance look like to support that economy?
So, Carrie, great question. I think of this almost every day. I easily think that our compliance from 69,233 can be slashed by half, and nobody will feel the heat. Neither government will feel the loss, nor the entrepreneur will feel that some control has been diluted. So, when we look at a $5 or $10 trillion economy, I can clearly see the compliance burden at least slashed by half. That's the first thing. We call it rationalize. There are a lot of redundancies, a lot of duplication, a lot of overlaps are there in our compliances. A similar intention, different outcomes. Too much is there. It can easily be slashed by half. So that's one. Second, I see a simplified compliance regime. We don't need 1,440 different permutations and combinations of minimum wages in the state of Karnataka. When center can bring it down to 56, I think other states need to take up that exercise and simplify this regime. The forms have to become simpler. The requirements have to become simpler. I envisage a much higher level of digitization, just like we have created Aadhaar for individuals. I visualize for a $10 trillion economy, we'll have UEN, Universal Enterprise Number, which will be like an Aadhaar for enterprises, which will enable a compliance profiling from a risk point of view so that all compliance interventions and actions from the government will be dependent on the compliance profile of the person, of the enterprise. I also envision a DigiLocker for enterprises, where enterprise will not be subjected to tons of paper. I was doing the math the other day. For a single factory to get started, there are about 1,000 sheets of paper that needs to get printed and submitted to various government departments, and this is one copy. Typically, organizations will keep 2 or 3 copies. One is an acknowledgement, one for their own records. So imagine one factory to get approved can create anywhere between 2 to 4,000 sheets, give or take, depending on the size. So all of this is not required. Government issues so many documents, and if DigiLocker can bring documents for an individual into a DigiLocker, like driving license, like voting card, and so many others, why can't we have an enterprise DigiLocker? So for a $10 trillion economy, I envisage that every document issued by the government will be available in the DigiLocker. Nobody will be required to print even a single copy of document and submit. You just give the entitlement for the corresponding department. They go to your DigiLocker, they look at it, and we can become more sustainable from an environment perspective also, while trying to become more efficient internally. So digitization will be there. Government will create a lot more utilities like NPCI. I envisage a compliance utility in the government, which will be like a plumbing, which will create all these APIs, facilitate interactions between enterprises and various departments without each department having to write its own, where this utility can do the job like NPCI or Aadhaar. This will become a public utility, and vendors like ourselves will be able to implement the APIs and enable a straight through compliance experience, where a document gets generated on the vendor platform. With a click of the button, the filing gets done, the acknowledgement, notification, receipt, whatever you want to call it, gets downloaded. A default, if any, gets highlighted. Mistake, if any, becomes digitally notified back to the enterprise. All of these things can go digital completely. And last but not the least, I expect a far more decriminalized environment in the country. Believe it or not, 40% of the 69,000 items have criminality associated, jail term associated with them. And we need to really rethink why entrepreneurs have to go to jail for, some of these missteps, some procedural lapses, and so on and so forth. So we need to classify them correctly, look at this at a holistic level, and change the way we work. So I propose a 4-vector framework of rationalize, simplify, digitize, and decriminalize if India has to get to a $10 trillion economy.
Amazing. So clearly, I mean, you have, you've been spending a lot of time thinking through all of these things, and that really shows in the insights that you shared. Thank you so much for joining us, Rishi. I mean, this was a fantastic conversation, and certainly, something that I will refer to often enough whenever compliance comes up in my radar. Yeah. So thank you so much again.
So, Carrie, thank you so much for having me here, and I wish that we can create a lot more entrepreneurs in India. That's how we'll get to $10 trillion economy, and happy to make my little contribution in this. And thanks again.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked this episode, then don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite platform and share this episode with all of your fellow startup operators. Also, follow the Startup Operator on LinkedIn and Twitter for more updates. Stay safe, take care, and see you soon on a brand new episode of the Startup Operator.